The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're just going to wait for a few minutes for a few more people to join us. So bear with us, please. Thank you. Levuyo, can you hear me?
Music,
can you unmute him?
Okay.
Levuyo, it's Mel here. Can you hear me? Hi there. Would you like us to wait a few minutes, or would you like us to start?
No, we can wait a few minutes for others to join us. It's fine with me.
Okay, we'll start in a few minutes then. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully it's okay to make a start now. Welcome from the IEA to this first webinar that we would have done with the Department of Energy in South Africa. We hope this will be the first of many, and we hope that we provide you with an interesting set of information and that you have many questions and comments for us as we go through. I'm going to start by handing over to our division head, Dr. Brian Motherway, who is going to give us some opening remarks.
Well, hello everybody, and greetings from Paris, where the weather I think is a little bit worse than the weather I hope you're experiencing in the various locations you're joining us from. So, as Mel says, we're very pleased to be holding this webinar, which we hope will be the first of very many events we hold together in the context of energy efficiency, but of course in the context of the new relationship between the IEA and South Africa as the latest member of what we like to call the IEA family, as an association member of the International Energy Agency. And in particular, the agency in the last couple of years has been putting a lot of stronger emphasis on the topic of energy efficiency all over the world. And this is in recognition that all countries are showing an increased interest in energy efficiency and realizing it is very important for delivering all of their energy goals, be they related to climate change, local air pollution, energy security, economic growth, social well-being. Energy efficiency has a part to play in all of these things. And therefore, we are very pleased to be working with governments all over the world to help them understand the opportunities they have for energy efficiency, and in particular to learn from each other in terms of what policies work, what types of options are available to governments to increase their energy efficiency and bring the maximum benefits from that. The kind of work we do includes what we're doing today in terms of a direct exchange with our colleagues and friends in South Africa, and we look forward to hearing your questions and comments later during this session. As you know, we also bring people together in various formats such as global conferences, which are now something we hold every single year for energy efficiency, as well as many global training events that I know many of our South African friends have participated in. And then we also produce our analysis, such as our annual market report, which you're about to hear all about, and various other reports, analyses, and web-based tools. So all of these are attempts to help countries understand energy efficiency and to understand what opportunities they can take away from it in terms of tackling their own priorities and their own issues. And today you'll hear our latest update on the global story for energy efficiency, both in terms of where we've got to up to 2018, but also where we think we can get to over the next couple of decades. And we have some very interesting insights that I hope you will find of use to you in terms of understanding where the greatest opportunities lie for energy efficiency in the future, what are the dynamics of what's driving energy demand patterns today, and ultimately what are the responses that policymakers might consider taking in order to address their issues of the future. So I do hope you enjoy the seminar. We look forward to hearing your questions and comments. Do please feel free to participate, and do please feel free afterwards to tell us what more we can do to work with you on energy efficiency. What are the topics you'd like to see us cover in these webinars? What other topics of conversation you'd like to engage with us on? And we look forward to building our relationship over the coming years.
Thank you, Brian. I'm now going to hand over to the team who's lost the picture. So I'm now going to hand over to Joe Ritchie and Hugo Salamanca, who are going to introduce the Energy Efficiency Market Report to you. Sorry, here are their pictures, Joe and Hugo. I think Hugo's going to start with explaining how the webinar system works before we go into the details of the market report. So thank you both.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Hugo Salamanca. I'll be moderating the webinar, and I'm joined by Joe Ritchie, who is one of the main coordinators of the market report, who will be presenting the main highlights. Here is the slide show of a snapshot of the attendee interface that you should be seeing on your computer. There are two ways to connect, either through your audio on the computer or by dialing in. I have included the toll-free number for South Africa, but please click on the telephone on your audio pane, which will display telephone numbers for additional countries. Just dial in that number and click telephone. You'll avoid feedback between your phone and computer audio. Please feel free to ask any questions on the question pane as they come to you, and we'll try to answer them at the end. Please note that we are recording the webinar, and we'll make a link available for those who have missed it. along with a link with the PowerPoint presentation. Finally, following the webinar, you will receive a short survey estimated to take around 2 minutes. Some of you have done this before. We're revising these surveys every time we send them out to get new feedback on the presentation and the priority topics, and appreciate your ideas. And now here's to Joe.
Great, thanks very much, Hugo, and thank you all for your interest in today's webinar and for the interest in the energy efficiency work of the IEA. So my name is Joe Ritchie. I was the coordinator for the market report this year. Here's the picture of the report. It's entitled Energy Efficiency 2018. It's the 6th edition in our annual market report series. And the book is split into 6 chapters. The first chapter looks at global trends and outlooks for energy efficiency, where we look at energy intensity and efficiency trends globally. We also introduce our new efficient world scenario, which has a look at the possible prospects for energy efficiency between now and 2040. And we also look at policy progress and trends, both globally and in major regions. And we present our efficient world strategy. And what the efficient world strategy is the policies and measures that we see as being needed if the world is to realise the potential for energy efficiency as described by the efficient world scenario. So I'll be touching on that in today's presentation. We also have sector chapters where we look at energy efficiency in the transport, buildings and industry sectors. We look at investment, finance and business models for energy efficiency. And in the last chapter of the book, we have a special focus this year where we look at current trends and future prospects for energy efficiency in emerging economies. And the 6 economies that we focus on are Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Mexico and South Africa. All these countries have been a focus of the IEA's Energy Efficiency in Emerging Economies program. And the report itself can actually be freely downloaded from iea.org/efficiency 2018. So I'll encourage everybody to do that. So for today's webinar, I'm going to be talking through some of the highlights from the report this year. I'm going to first of all look at energy efficiency trends and outlooks. I'll do that globally and also touch on some trends in South Africa. And I'll also compare that to some trends in my home country, Australia, which has a fairly similar economic structure, particularly the prominence of the extractives and mineral and resource industry. We'll also then talk about energy efficiency policy and investment, and then touch on energy efficiency at the subsector level, particularly transport, buildings and industry. And in those sections, I'll talk a bit about some of the policy recommendations that we highlight in our efficient world strategy. And hopefully at the end, we'll have a bit of time for some questions and answers. But please don't wait until the end to send those through. If you have any questions, please type them into, please type them in as they come to mind. But I will just say now that I am refusing to answer any questions relating to the Australian rugby or cricket teams. So that's a no for me right now. Okay, so one of the key metrics that we look at in this year's energy efficiency market report is the change in global primary energy demand. And what you can see here on this graph at the moment is the percentage increase in global primary energy demand in every year of this decade. We can see here that in 2011 and 2012, that primary energy demand increased by about 1.5%. In 2013 and 2014, the increase was slower. And in 2015 and 2016, primary energy demand globally increased by only around 0.5%. So we had been experiencing a fairly low period of primary energy demand growth. But in 2017, the trend has been much different. In 2017, global energy demand has has risen by nearly 2%. That's actually the fastest rise this decade. And as I'll talk about in a few slides' time, this has been driven by economic growth, activity increases, and also some changes in consumer behaviour. The other important global metric that we track is the change in global primary energy intensity. So this is primary energy demand per unit of GDP. And obviously, we want this to go down each year because that means that the world is becoming less energy intensive and we are able to produce more GDP for every unit of energy use. So what you can see here is that this decade, global primary energy intensity has been improving. It was actually improving at a faster rate, and in 2015 and 2016, it was around 2.5% the rate of improvement. But in 2017, we again saw a much different trend. In 2017, global primary energy intensity improved by only 1.7%. That's actually the slowest rate this decade, and one of the key factors that contributes to these energy intensity improvements has actually been China. What you can see here with these bars on the graph at the moment is what global primary energy intensity improvement would have been had it not been for improvements within China. What we can see here is that China has now become an important driver of global energy intensity improvements. And in 2017, had it not been for improvements in China, global primary energy intensity would have only improved by about 1.2%. So China has become a very important driver of global energy intensity improvement. Now, I mentioned in the first slide that global primary energy demand increased at its fastest rate this decade in 2017. And to get an understanding about what factors are contributing to this increase in energy demand and energy use, at the IEA, we undertake decomposition analysis. And essentially, decomposition analysis allows us to analyse the different factors that influence energy use and whether or not they put upwards pressure on energy use or they put downwards pressure on energy use. And on this slide here, we look at a decomposition of final energy use in the world's major economies that cover about 75% of global energy use. So what you can see here on the slide at the moment is the energy use for these major economies in 2000. But there's been obviously a lot of factors that have influenced energy use between then and 2017. The first of those, which has put upward pressure on energy use, has been an increase in the amount of building floor space and also an increase in appliance ownership. And this goes across developing and the developed world. We've also seen less efficient transport patterns. Now, what I mean by less efficient transport patterns is firstly that people are moving away from more efficient forms of transport, like public transport or motorbikes or scooters, towards passenger vehicles, so their own personal vehicles. And in many cases, they're also moving towards larger, less efficient passenger vehicles, like sport utility vehicles, that are obviously larger, in some cases more comfortable, but are obviously less fuel efficient than smaller passenger cars. And we're also seeing occupancy levels fall. And so people are driving longer and they're driving with fewer people in their vehicle. And all these factors combined put upwards pressure on energy use. The biggest factor putting upwards pressure on energy use has been increasing activity levels. Now, these activity levels include things like increasing population, increasing transport activity, like passenger kilometres or tonne kilometres, and also increases in the amount of gross value added produced by the global industry and service sectors. All these factors, again, put upwards pressure on energy use, and this is, in this case, has been quite substantial. But there are factors that are offsetting these increases. The first of those is shifts in economic activity. In particular, the shifting of economic activity away from energy-intensive sectors like iron and steel or cement manufacturing towards less energy-intensive sectors like food and beverage manufacturing or textile manufacturing, and also the services sectors. And so that puts downward pressure on energy use. And importantly, the other factor is improvements in energy efficiency. So what we can see here is that energy efficiency is improving, but that its impact is being overwhelmed by factors that are creating more demand for energy. In particular, these increasing activity levels, which are all linked to economic growth. And just focusing here on energy efficiency for a bit more, to really get an understanding about what the impact of energy efficiency has been, we look at this graph here, where we look at a trend for global GDP in the green line and global energy use and global emissions, represented here by these two dark blue lines. What we can see here is that for both energy use and emissions, there has been some decoupling of these trends from global GDP, which is a good outcome. And you can also see here for emissions that in the years from 2014 to 2016, there was actually a flattening in global greenhouse gas emissions. This is a very important trend, but in 2017, along with an increase in global energy use, global greenhouse gas emissions also rose. So that's obviously been a somewhat unwanted break from the trend that we had seen. But the question that we can ask is, what would these energy use and emissions trends had been if it wasn't for improvements in energy efficiency since 2000? Well, here we see that. In terms of energy use, energy efficiency improvements since 2000 have actually prevented 12% more energy use in 2017. And similarly for emissions, energy efficiency improvements since 2000 prevented 12% more emissions. In terms of energy use, this prevention of 12% additional energy use would have been like adding another European Union to the global energy system. And for emissions, this is essentially an additional 4 billion tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions that would have been, emitted to the atmosphere. And we also would not have seen the flattening of global greenhouse gas emissions that we saw between 2014 and 2016. So the impact is very important. In terms of where the actual efficiency gains are being made at a sectoral level, what we have found is that it is the industry sector, underpinned by actions in China and North America, that is responsible for the largest percentage of global energy efficiency improvement. Similarly, we also see substantial improvement in the building sector. They've been responsible for about 38% of global energy efficiency gains. But the transport sector has had a smaller contribution. It's only contributing about 11% of the efficiency gains in the major economies that we've analysed. And the reason for that is because transport policy has been somewhat variable, and also there's been a lot of activity growth and changing consumer patterns in the transport sector. So now looking at trends in South Africa, which we also did as part of Chapter 6 of this year's market report. And here we present a decomposition of South African final energy use between 2000 and 2017. What you can see here is that activity increases within the South African economy have put upwards pressure on energy use. We've also seen some structural changes within the South African economy. In particular, we've seen more buildings and more appliances, and also changes in transport behaviour that has put upwards pressure on energy use. And we haven't seen the same degree of energy efficiency improvement that we have in other countries. And the reason for this is because the energy efficiency gains that we have seen in the passenger transport, freight transport, and residential building sectors have actually been cancelled out by a slight worsening of energy efficiency in the South African industry and services sector. So our analysis showed that this worsening of energy efficiency within the industry and services sector started in about 2009 as a result of the increase in electricity tariffs within South Africa as a result of deregulation of the energy market. But one thing that we do note, and it's important to note in the report, is that this trend of worsening energy efficiency is reversing. In the last couple of years, energy efficiency has been improving within the South African industry and services sector, and so we expect this trend to not last for the future. And this has been linked to policies such as measures to increase the adoption of energy management systems and also the growth of the South African ESCO industry. Now, I said that we would compare these trends to Australia, and what we see here is the decomposition of final energy use in Australia between 2000 and 2017. We've again seen strong activity growth in Australia, which has put upwards pressure on energy use, but we've seen structural change in Australia put downward pressure on energy use, and that's because in Australia there has been a movement away of economic activity from the energy-intensive sectors like iron and steel, aluminium and cement towards the services sector. And that has actually had a larger impact on energy use in Australia than improvements in energy efficiency have had. And when we look at the source of efficiency gains within the Australian economy, it is the residential buildings and industry and service sectors that are responsible for the majority of efficiency gains in Australia since 2000. And in industry and services, this is because of growing output, but also improvements in energy efficiency. So what I've talked about so far has been based on historic trends. So what's happened since 2000. But as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, in this year's market report, we also look to the future and look at what a more efficient world could actually look like. Because one thing that's important to note is that the world is actually missing opportunities to improve energy efficiency. The current policy settings that we have in place are not delivering the full potential for energy efficiency that is available with current technology. And so therefore, in this year's market report, we wanted to ask the question, what is possible with greater efforts on energy efficiency? And to do this, we worked with our colleagues in the World Energy Outlook to develop a new efficient world scenario that answered the question, what would happen between now and 2040 if countries realised all the economically viable energy efficiency potential that is available today? And so just to pause on this statement here for a bit, economically viable means that all of the measures, the energy efficiency measures that we consider in this efficient world scenario are cost effective. They pay back during the life of the measure. And by available today, this means that all of the measures included in our efficient world scenario, or EWS as we refer to it in the report, are based on current technology. So it's a scenario that we not only see as being possible, but also something that would be, I suppose, reasonable in some ways, because all the measures are economically viable and they use currently available technology. And in this efficient world scenario, we look at the impacts of energy efficiency between now and 2040 on the global economy, the global energy system, and importantly, the environment as well. So what would the benefits or what would the impacts be? Well, at a global level, what you can see here is a bit of an illustration or representation of global GDP at present and global energy demand at present. Between now and 2040, it is possible for global GDP to actually double. So the size of the global economy could be twice as large in 2040 as it is right now. But in our efficient world scenario, what would happen to global energy demand? Well, what we can see here is that global energy demand would only increase very marginally. So what this means is that the world would actually be able to produce twice as much GDP for every unit of energy use, and that would be a substantial improvement in global energy productivity and global energy intensity. And to highlight these energy intensity trends a bit further, what you can see here on this slide is primary energy intensity both globally and in the 6 major emerging economies that have been the focus of analysis in this year's report. What you see here at the moment is primary energy intensity, so primary energy demand per unit of GDP in 2000 and in 2016 for the world and for the countries analysed. So in all cases, we've seen primary energy demand increase, although the rates are somewhat variable and the absolute levels of energy intensity are still variable. But in our efficient world scenario in 2040, energy intensity in all the regions analysed would actually fall. This includes South Africa. We would again see a fairly substantial drop in energy intensity as a result of increased efforts on energy efficiency. And across all the 6 economies that we've analysed in this year's report, in Chapter 6 of this year's report, energy intensity could decline by over 50%. That would be a substantial benefit in terms of energy intensity. So another question obviously is, where is the potential for energy efficiency greatest, and in what sectors are the opportunities largest? So in answering this question, we first of all recognise in the report that policies that governments currently have in place or have announced will actually realise some of the energy efficiency potential that exists today. We describe this via the IEA's new policy scenario, which is effectively used in this report as a sort of baseline scenario. But what's important to note here is that the new policy scenario does not realise all of the energy efficiency opportunity that is presented by the Efficient World scenario. The majority of energy efficiency potential remains untapped with current and announced policies, and there's a lot more potential that exists. In terms of the sectors where this potential is greatest, what you can see here is that as a result of improvements in fuel efficiency and also the increased adoption of electric vehicles, that the transport sector represents the largest opportunity for efficiency gains, followed by buildings and industry. Now, what's important to note here is that the order of the potential for energy efficiency gains is actually the reverse of the historical trend. So a few slides ago, I mentioned that industry was responsible for over half of the efficiency gains that we have seen since 2000. But into the future, it will actually be transport that is where there is the largest potential for energy efficiency gains. So again, that illustrates that there is a lot of potential in transport that has not yet been realised. Now, I mentioned obviously that we look at the benefits of energy efficiency between now and 2040 for the global environment. And a key, I suppose, piece of analysis for that is the impact on global greenhouse gas emissions. So what you can see here is historical greenhouse gas emissions since 2000, and also a projection for where emissions would go between now and 2040 under the IEA's new policy scenario. So this is where governments maintain current policies and implement what they have announced, but don't do anything else. And so what we see here is that under that scenario, emissions would increase, and obviously the world would not realise its objectives under the Paris Agreement. But in the Efficient World scenario, we see a much different trend. Global greenhouse gas emissions would actually peak before 2040 and then fall to levels that are 12% lower than today by 2040. And this drop in emissions would actually represent about 40% of the abatement that will be required by 2040 for the world to be in line with the objectives described by the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And so therefore, one thing that we conclude, and I hope that people will agree with this as well, is that energy efficiency is indispensable to achieving global climate targets. The other, obviously, environmental benefit that efficiency can provide is a reduction in air pollutants. And in the report, we look at the reduction in air pollutants, particularly sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter. And in the Efficient World scenario, these emissions are a third lower in 2040 than they are at present. And this has substantial benefits, particularly for human health, as a result of a reduction in indoor air pollution. So turning now to the forecast for South Africa and what the opportunity is for South Africa between now and 2040. What we can see here on the left is South Africa's final energy use since 2012, represented by this black line here, and what could happen in South Africa if current policies and announced policies are implemented. So this is South Africa's projected total final energy use under the new policy scenario. So what we would see is energy use rise as a result of increasing economic activity and more and obviously increased living standards within the country. But in the Efficient World scenario, we would see a much different trend, energy demand would actually increase at a much slower rate, and as a result, in 2040, South Africa could avoid over 500 petajoules of additional final energy use as a result of tapping into opportunities to improve energy efficiency. In terms of the sectors where these savings are highest, what we can see here is that it is the industry and transport sectors where there is actually the greatest potential for energy efficiency gains into the future. When we look at emissions, we see that as a result of current policies, that South Africa's emissions are actually forecast to fall between now and 2040. But as this red line shows, with increased efforts on energy efficiency, the decline in emissions could be even higher. Emissions could actually fall by nearly 25% between now and 2040, and that's as a result of, that is an indication of South Africa's high dependence on coal for electricity generation, and so therefore an improvement in energy efficiency linked to reduced demand for electricity or more efficient demand for electricity would result in a reduction in emissions. So a substantial environmental benefit to be gained in South Africa as a result of greater efforts on energy efficiency. So I've talked there about some of the energy use and emissions benefits, but the efficient world scenario also highlights the benefits that energy efficiency can bring to all levels of the economy. And one of the key benefits that we highlight is an improvement in energy security as a result of a reduction or an avoidance of fossil fuel imports. We highlight in the report that the efficient world scenario by 2040 could see US $700 billion of energy imports be avoided in the European Union, in China and India. And in South Africa, it could be about $13 billion of avoided fossil fuel imports, primarily linked to reductions in imports of oil and natural gas. In industry, well, we could see energy expenditure of around US $600 billion avoided in 2040 as a result of the efficiency measures described by our efficient world scenario. And in South Africa, this could be about $6 billion worth of avoided energy expenditure. And in terms of households, we could see over $550 billion of avoided household energy spending in 2040, and around $2 billion of that would be in South Africa. So we see the benefits here for the global economy and a strategic benefit in terms of a reduction in energy imports. At a sectoral level, we see a reduction in energy expenditure, and down to households, we see a reduction in energy spending. So this shows that energy efficiency brings benefits to all levels of the economy. So that's some of the efficiency trends and outlooks. I'm now going to turn to look at energy efficiency policy and investment, which have been important factors that drive the efficiency gains that we have observed since 2000, and will also be critical as we look to realise the efficiency potential between now and 2040. And a key policy measure that we analyse at the IEA is mandatory energy efficiency policies. So these mandatory policies include things like appliance standards, building codes, fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks, and also energy efficiency improvement targets that might be applied to industrial companies or industrial sectors. And what we do to get an understanding of the scope of these policies is quantify the amount of final energy use that is actually covered by mandatory energy efficiency policies. And so this means how many refrigerators are covered by a minimum energy performance standard, how many cars are in operation that were purchased under a fuel economy standard, and how many buildings are constructed or renovated according to a building energy code. We look at all those aspects and estimate the amount of energy use for those end users that are covered by mandatory energy efficiency policies. And that, as I said, gives us an understanding of the current scope and the breadth of those policies. So first of all, we see here the amount of energy use covered by mandatory energy efficiency policies, both in total and across the major end use sectors for the world as a whole. What we can see here is that globally, the majority of final energy use is not covered by mandatory energy efficiency policies. In 2017, about 34% of global energy use was covered by mandatory energy efficiency policies, with the non-residential building sector having the highest coverage because of the presence of building codes in a lot of developed and emerging economies. Looking now at the coverage in South Africa, and we see a different trend. Across all sectors, policy coverage in South Africa is lower than the global average. Now, the reason for this is because mandatory policies to date have not been implemented in South Africa to the same extent that they have been in other countries. But one thing that we do highlight in the report, and that it must be recognised, is that many of the policies that we would capture as part of this coverage analysis are actually planned for implementation as part of South Africa's National Energy Efficiency Strategy. So these policies include things like MEPs for industrial motors, fuel economy standards for the transport sector, and of course codes for buildings. And so the implementation of these policies will actually see coverage in South Africa grow into the future. When we look at policy coverage in Australia, we can see that as Australia has had minimum energy performance standards for electric motors since 2006, that around 11% of industrial energy use is covered by mandatory standards. We also see extensive policies in place with building codes at the residential level and at the commercial level, as well as appliance standards, which push coverage up in the building sector. But there are no passenger or freight transport fuel economy standards of any type in Australia, and so policy coverage is very low. But it is at present higher than South Africa, but as I said earlier, we do expect that South Africa's policy coverage will grow into the future. Another important type of mandatory energy efficiency policy that we look at are utility obligations. And what we mean by an energy utility obligation is where energy suppliers, retailers or distributors are actually obligated to obtain a certain amount of energy savings each year. So each year, energy suppliers that are captured by this obligation are required to obtain a certain number of energy savings, either from their own operations or through their customers or through the general market. And what this policy measure does is that it creates a market demand for energy efficiency. So it creates demand where there otherwise would not be, and it gets the energy supply industry involved in looking for energy efficiency opportunities. And what we have found is that these obligation schemes have become increasingly prominent within the global policy landscape. And in 2017, nearly 18% of global energy use was actually captured by a utility obligation. However, one of the things that we are seeing here is that new policies and the implementation of new policies has actually slowed in the last couple of years. We haven't seen a lot of new policies introduced, and as a result, we haven't seen the impact of these policies grow to the extent that would be possible. I do note that South Africa has an obligation scheme which is incorporated within this other bar here. Now, the other policy measure that we look at, this is not a mandatory policy, but it is more a voluntary policy, fiscal and financial incentives for energy efficiency. So this is where national governments provide a financial incentive for companies or for households to actually improve energy efficiency. And what we can see here is that energy efficiency incentives in 2017 totaled about US $27 billion. And when we include electric vehicles, it makes the transport sector the largest recipient of these incentives. So that's obviously been an important benefit there. Now, all of these energy efficiency measures and the impact of policies has to be paid for. And to do that, we look at energy efficiency investment. And in 2015 and 2016, as you can see on this slide here, global energy efficiency investment increased. And in 2017, it increased again, but by a slower rate. energy efficiency investment grew by only 3% to about US $236 billion. And when we look at the investment at a sectoral level, we can see here that the building sector, represented by this dark blue line here on the edge, is responsible for about 60% of global energy efficiency investment. And that's because in the building sector, there are a lot of low-cost, scalable, and easily aggregated energy efficiency measures. And that means that that sector represents the majority of investment. But the other thing for investment that we need to note is that if we are to realise the opportunity presented by the efficient world scenario, that investment levels must rise. Here we see current investment levels, but in the efficient world scenario, these investment levels increase. Between 2017 and 2025, annual energy efficiency investment needs to increase, needs to double, and between 2026 and 2040, this annual investment needs to double again. And as a result, there is a need for policy to facilitate finance and business model innovation in order to stimulate this level of investment. So I'm now going to go through the trends on a sectoral basis, but I'm aware that we're touching on time a little bit. We're sort of maybe only got about 15 minutes or so left before we reach the end of the hour. So we do want to get to questions. So I will go through these a little bit quicker, but obviously you'll have the slides. And obviously if you have any questions about that, then please write them down. So we look here, first of all, at transport. And what we can see here in this graph is the average annual efficiency improvement across the various subsectors within transport. We can see, looking here in particular, that passenger light duty vehicles, essentially cars, and road freight, essentially trucks, their average annual energy efficiency improvement has been quite low between 2016 and between 2000 and 2016. But in our efficient world scenario, that could be very different. We could actually see energy efficiency within passenger cars and road freight increase in some cases by a factor of about 20, and that's as a result of strong improvements in vehicle fuel economy and also the increased adoption of electric vehicles. I'll skip over this slide here and that slide, and then I'll talk about some of the policy measures that we highlight as being needed to actually realise the opportunity within the transport sector as described by the IEA's efficient world scenario. So in the transport sector, first of all, what's possible by 2040 as a result of increased levels of effort on energy efficiency? Well, energy demand in the transport sector could actually stay flat despite a doubling of activity levels, with passenger cars and trucks offering about 2/3 of potential energy efficiency savings. And some of the key policy actions that we highlight as being necessary to realise these efficiency gains include improvements in the coverage and strength of fuel economy or fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks, but also including a focus on policies for aviation and shipping. There's also an important role for incentives, as we've highlighted earlier, to support the uptake and sustainable use of efficient vehicles. And in particular, incentives for electric vehicles will be very important to drive uptake there. And also there is a need for information, capacity building and training in order to support the uptake of efficient vehicles and also encourage people to shift to more efficient modes of transport. Turning now to the building sector, and again, here we see the improvement in energy intensity between 2000 and 2017 across the various major end uses within the building sector. So we can see here that it's fairly variable. Space heating has had strong improvement, but space cooling and appliances have not seen the same level of improvement. And that is because we've seen an increase in appliance ownership, which has obviously impacted energy intensity in those sectors. But as we look to the future in the efficient world scenario, energy efficiency could actually improve across all aspects of the building sector, And in terms of where these savings are greatest, it's actually space heating as a result of improvements in appliance standards and improved insulation. There's also improvements in water heating. And importantly, for countries like South Africa, there's an improvement in space cooling. These three measures combined account for about 60% of the potential energy savings. Again, skipping over the next two slides to get to our policy recommendations. So again, what is possible by 2040? We do highlight that in a more efficient world, building space could actually increase by 60%, but energy use would not. We would have 60% more building floor space for no additional energy use, and space heating, cooling, and water heating offer the majority of savings. In terms of the policies that we see as being needed, again, comprehensive efficiency policies that target both new and existing building stock and appliances are seen as being very important, as are incentives, again, to encourage consumers to adopt high efficiency appliances and undertake deep energy retrofits. And we also see a need to improve the quality and availability of energy performance information and also tools that can help people make better decisions about building energy efficiency. So the last sector for today that I want to talk about is the industry sector. And again, on this graph, which is similar to what I showed for buildings and transport, we can see the percentage improvement in energy intensity across the major industrial subsectors. We can see here that in some subsectors, in particular cement, as a result of new production capacity being installed in China and India since 2000, there's actually been a strong increase in energy intensity improvement. And as we look to the future in the efficient world scenario, we again see energy efficiency improvements increasing in effectively all industry subsectors. In particular, efficiency improvements are quite profound in the iron and steel sector as a result of increasing the amount of iron and steel recycling. We also see very large gains in this sector, which is collectively referred to as other industries. And this is as a result of measures to improve the efficiency of motor-driven systems and also to deploy more energy efficient electric heat pumps for process heating. When we look at the policy recommendations that could realise this potential, again, when we look at first of all what's possible in the industry sector by 2040, here on the left, in the industry sector, in our efficient world scenario, we could see value added per unit of energy demand double, with the less energy intensive industry sectors, which are categorised by that other industries that I talked about in the previous slide, offering around 70% of the potential savings. And the key policy actions that we identify as being necessary include expanding and strengthening standards for key industrial equipment, such as electric heat pumps and motors. There's also an important role for incentives to encourage the adoption of energy management systems. Energy management systems like ISO 50001 are very important for driving efficiency and gains across the entirety of an industrial process. And also mechanisms like industry networks, training and case studies will be important in order to enhance awareness and capacity of industry to actually realise the energy efficiency gains that are possible. So that's I suppose the main thrust of the presentation today. There's a couple of concluding remarks that I'll leave up on screen for now, but I think we can probably go to taking some questions if we want. Apologies for going a bit over, but hopefully we'll be able to have a few questions.
Thank you, Joe, for the presentation. So we have a few minutes for questions. So we have one at the moment on the agricultural sector. So is the agricultural sector included in the analysis?
Yes, so the agriculture sector is included within the broader industry and services sector. The agriculture sector, the energy use within that is dwarfed by the other industry sectors, iron and steel, chemicals manufacturing, cement manufacturing, and also the services sector. But yes, agriculture is included. We don't normally break it out in the analysis, and one of the reasons for that is that it hasn't actually been an area where we've seen a lot of policy focus to date. A lot of the time in the agriculture sector, it's individual farmers as opposed to large companies. And so, one, the energy use isn't as high, but two, the policy focus hasn't been as great, but it is incorporated within the industry and services sector.
I don't know if we have any other questions in the audience. Feel free to write them and we'll address them now, or if you have them later on, of course, don't hesitate to send them through.
So if you know, while you're taking the time to actually write any other questions that you have, and obviously if you do have any, please feel free. Just to go through some of the concluding remarks, the efficient world scenario that we present in our market report this year shows a world in 2040 that has double the GDP that we do today. It has more people and more buildings, but it has basically no more energy use and lower emissions than we have today. And that's all as a result of energy efficiency. We also showed, as I mentioned earlier, that energy efficiency can reduce air pollution, imports and consumer bills, and that we also deliver some of the Sustainable Development Goals that have been established by the United Nations. All of the efficiency opportunities that we highlight in our efficient world scenario are cost effective. They only use technology that's available today, but we do see there as being a need for a significant step up in policy action. We highlight that through measures like increasing the strength and coverage of mandatory energy efficiency policies, and also incentivizing greater levels of energy efficiency and improving the availability and quality of information. When we look at investments, there is a need for investments to double between now and 2025, and then double again between 2026 and 2040 in order to realise the potential of the efficient world scenario. But all these investments are cost effective. In fact, they pay back by a factor of 3 on average over the life of the measure. And this payback is on the basis of energy savings alone. So they are all very cost effective and make economic sense. And when I talk about some of the policies that are required in order to realise the opportunity as described by our efficient world scenario, there are at present good examples of all the policies that are required at the moment. They are implemented in some form and operating in some capacity everywhere in the world, or somewhere in the world, and they will form the basis for increased ambition and impact. So policy doesn't necessarily, we don't have to necessarily reinvent the wheel on the policy front. We just need to do more of what is actually working and what we have highlighted as being effective. And in doing that, it's important to note that the IEA has and will continue to work with governments to provide analysis, like I've talked through today, to talk about policy guidance, exchange and capacity building, such as what Brian Motherway mentioned at the start of the webinar, as we all want to work towards a more efficient world. So those are the concluding remarks. Did we have any other questions that have come through?
No, not additional questions. So I think
no. Okay. I think we'll hand back over to Mel for closing words. But just from me, thanks very much for the interest in the work and the energy efficiency market report for 2017 or 2018, I should say. Again, if you would like to download the report, it's free to do so from the IEA website. Thanks again. And if you have any questions, please feel free to type those in, or you can also send them to us after the webinar, and we're happy to get back to you on that. But thanks very much from me.
So thank you, Joe. Thank you, Hugo. Thank you, Brian, for the presentation. We hope you found them useful. And please do send us your questions by email, as we'll have to sign off in a moment, and we'll be very happy to answer them. And also let us know how the webinar process works for you, and then we'll try to do a better job next time. Is there something there?
there's a question that just popped up. Like we wanted to
Yes. Yep.
So I'm going to read it. Has the energy efficiency impact of holistic planning policies such as transit-oriented development in urban centers been considered?
Yeah, so this is a good question actually. So this is something that in the efficient world scenario, we don't have the efficient world scenario into the future that we look at considers primarily actions relating to improvements in technology efficiency, so improving the mileage of vehicles or the fuel economy of vehicles. Measures like better town planning that might encourage modal shift, might encourage better public transport utilisation, might encourage modal shift, bikes or other more energy efficient vehicles, and also other things into the future like electric cars, automated cars and that kind of thing. That isn't actually included in the efficient world scenario. And so therefore, those measures could actually unlock even greater savings than we have forecast here today. And the reason for that is that, many of those policies are being developed or are being trialled by cities. And so we don't really have a firm idea about what the impact of those would be and what the energy savings would be. We have a good idea about what's possible from a technical perspective, but when we look at the impact of those sorts of policies, it's a little bit more difficult to model. And so, the answer to the question is, whilst they're not included, they could potentially have an even greater impact on energy efficiency, particularly, as I said, as a result of people moving towards more efficient modes of transport or utilising public transport in a better way.
Right, I think the important message there and to sign off with is the efficient world scenario, in our view, is actually quite a conservative scenario because it's based on what we know today. It doesn't, as Joe said, bank on any developments in technology, any reduction in cost of technology. It's absolutely cost effective today. So we see it as absolutely achievable, and we hope that we can collectively do better than that. So we're going to sign off there. As I was saying, please send us your questions and your comments on the webinar as a process, and hopefully we can use it to share information as we go forward. And Hugo will be in touch on that respect. So good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Just a quick reminder that the presentation, the slides of the presentation will be available on the E4 webpage, as well as the recording of this webinar. You'll be receiving, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, a survey. Please send us your feedback. And on that, have a very nice evening.